I'm your host, David, and this is the Cold War Channel. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Ian Saunders, from one of my personal favorite podcasts, the Cold War Conversations podcast. I've been listening to this podcast almost since it came out. There's got quite a large back catalog for those of you who are interested in Cold War. Now, Ian, unlike our channel here, Ian specializes in having conversations and talking to people who lived through the Cold War. It's a lot of personal recollections and personal events from people who lived through some of the key moments and some people who just happened to be there. Lots of focus on Europe, lots of focus on Berlin, there's been some incredible guests, and I'm very pleased to welcome Ian onto the channel. Welcome, Ian.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you. It's a pleasure to come on. I mean, I've been a big fan of Cold War TV for quite some time, and you're right. We've been going for about 2 years now. I think I've added up the audio. It's about 4 days worth of audio for the mega fan. I don't recommend trying to listen to it for that long, but yes, some really interesting guests, and delighted to collaborate with you over our 6 pivotal moments of the Cold War, because I'm sure, well, I know that we are going to have differing opinions here. So particularly looking forward to chatting with a fellow Cold War buff and seeing how we get on. So do you want to start?
Okay, so as Ian has just mentioned, what we're going to be doing here, part of this collaboration, is we're going to be each stating our 6 most pivotal moments of the Cold War, and we're going to have a little, I'm not going to say debate, because I don't think that there's no right or wrong answers. There's probably a couple, but there's no right or wrong answers. But we'll have a little discussion surrounding that, and of course, people are free to join us in the comments section, where people can discuss whether they think that we're right, wrong, or maybe even things that we've possibly missed. So, okay, Ian, you'd like me to go first, I guess.
Yeah, let's have you go first, David.
Sure. So for me, from what the research and the studies that I've done in the Cold War, for me, one of the earliest, most pivotal moments in the Cold War was actually the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. 1950, French forces set themselves up in a camp high up in the mountains in the highlands, the North Vietnamese highlands, and General Giap's troops surround the camp and set up a month-long engagement, actually, using artillery that have been carried by hand up into the mountains. And the French forces, after fighting for months, eventually surrender, and that ends French presence in Indochina. Might not seem that significant, however, what it does lead to is a divided Vietnam. You have North Vietnam in the north, of course, backed by the communists, and in the south, you've got a quote-unquote democratic South being suddenly backed more by the Americans. And that actually kicks off the start of 20 years of direct American engagement in Southeast Asia. That is one of the longest, most drawn-out conflicts that happens directly involving the 2 superpowers. And as a result of that, what you see is over those 20 years is American troops heavily engaged and then withdrawing completely from Southeast Asia by 1975. And the decision from there by the Americans to really never put boots on the ground again unless they can decisively win, which you actually see in the first Gulf War, which is that tail end of the Cold War period. And what it means is that the Americans, without wanting to put their own troops in harm's way, it sponsors the whole wave of proxy wars from the even as early as the 60s, but the proxy wars that stretch through, especially into the 80s. For me, Dien Bien Phu is one of those key moments in the Cold War.
Yeah, and how much Soviet influence was involved in that?
In the the loss by the French, like the
Yeah,
support to the North
yeah.
Vietnamese. The Soviets certainly were heavily involved in terms of funding. There was arms supplies, Chinese support as well. This is
Mm,
pre-Sino-Soviet split. Lot of history, obviously, between the Vietnamese and the Chinese, but the Viet Minh was not necessarily a hardcore communist organization at that point. It was still very much a nationalist organization without the trappings over top of it of sort of the ideologies that became heavily prevalent later on after an American rebuff actually towards Ho Chi Minh and those involved in the Viet Minh movement looking for Vietnamese independence.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's because our podcast, as you said, is quite Eurocentric, and that's something I'm trying to remedy. Um, and so, therefore, I tend to look at the European theatre rather than some of the early nationalist proxy wars, as you said, that were going on. I mean, you can refer to Malaya and the Malayan emergency as being perhaps one of the early ones there, where the British were trying to suppress a nationalist uprising, but it was communist backed. Go on, you were going to say
No,
something.
I always have something to say, Ian. I think that's actually very characteristic of a lot of the proxy wars. Is there these trappings of ideology that get almost bolted onto fundamentally nationalist movements. The decolonization process across Asia and especially across Africa saw lots and lots of uprisings against colonial leadership or formerly colonial-backed leadership. But these nationalist movements found support from Moscow, or from Beijing, depending where they were. As a result of that, you get this ideological bolt-on that fundamentally probably could have been avoided with different set of decisions, whatnot. But in my opinion, anyways, ideology was never a core factor in a lot of the nationalist movements. It's very much nationalism with whomever you can get funding from, and you pay the lip service towards that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, my first one would be the Berlin blockade of 1948 to 49. For those of you that don't know what the Berlin blockade was, is Berlin, or West Berlin, which was made up of three Allied sectors: the American, the French, and the British. Was about 100 miles inside East Germany. It was an island in the Soviet zone. Under post-war treaties, it was allowed to be supplied by road, rail, and air. But in 1948, the Soviets withdrew rail and road access to the Allied sectors in West Berlin. So the Allies were forced to resupply the city by air, which had never been done before. And this was triggered to some degree by the Allies bringing in the Deutschmark, which was the new currency that had been brought into West Germany, into West Berlin. And the Soviets did, in fact, offer to drop the blockade if the Western Allies withdrew the Deutschmark. But it was the first sign of, I would say, direct confrontation, or the removal of any semblance of a continuation of the relationship that the Soviet Union and the Allies had during World War II. It really put the Western Allies on notice that things had changed and the Soviets were going to get aggressive in their intentions over certainly West Berlin. But I think what's important here is it did underline a Western determination to hang on to West Berlin. Without the airlift, it the population could well have starved, and therefore, potentially, made a decision to surrender and allow West Berlin to become part of East Germany. But with the effectiveness of the resupply, the city was able to be supplied by air during that period. And so inevitably the Soviets decided we're not getting anywhere here, and then removed the blockade. So the Allies were able to continue to supply the city by road and rail. And as a result, huge supplies were kept in West Berlin just in case of the eventuality of another blockade. And the position of West Berlin was very much reaffirmed by Kennedy in the 1960s when he made his very famous speech where he said he was a hamburger, which is a type of Berlin food. He said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and in Berlin speak, that means I am a hamburger. But the sentiment was right. I think he came across very, very well there. But that, I would say, that is probably the one of the first pivotal moments of the Cold War.
So, question for you: why do you think the Allies were so keen to hang on to that island? I mean, there was the West knew, even beyond the Berlin blockade, with the establishment of their Berlin Brigade and the three occupying forces, because they remained occupying forces for decades. They would only have ever been a speed bump in the event that the Eastern Bloc countries decided to attack. What was this? Why was it so important for them to hang on to this and spend so much time, effort, money, and blood in terms of maintaining Berlin?
I think it's because they needed to draw a line in the sand there. If they'd let Berlin go, what might have happened in other cities? I mean, what you've got to remember also is Austria was in a similar position. Vienna was a city divided into 4 sectors, albeit it wasn't in the middle of the Soviet zone, but it was divided into 4 sectors, and it was still an occupied country. So I think it's easy with hindsight to look and sort of question that. But at the time, withdrawal from West Berlin would have been a sign of weakness that may have been exploited elsewhere. I think the other thing is West Berlin was a great location for intelligence gathering. It was right in the heart of East Germany. So as far as monitoring, wireless communications, it was really useful. There was also the military liaison units that could tour all around East Germany, keeping an eye on the Soviet hardware. And at this point, the wall wasn't up. So East Berlin and West Berlin, it was a very porous frontier. So as far as getting agents into the East, it made it a lot easier to get agents in the East. So I think there's a number of reasons there, but I think the main one is machismo, really. It's like we're not going to let you take over this place.
Excellent. No, I certainly, when I was formulating my list, it's hard to leave the Berlin blockade, the airlift, off of there. I consciously made the decision to do that, to sort of branch out into some other sort of lesser known, but what I feel are key moments that sort of set trajectory through the Cold War period. So, but certainly, the Berlin airlift is a massive and major event and turning point. So
yeah, and I think you're right also to mention the proxy wars, because I think they get forgotten about in the greater overall Cold War picture, yet they are pivotal in their own ways in terms of certainly framing American military views, particularly around the Vietnam War, and also the war that I'm going to come on to shortly in my second point.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, my
second point, Ian.
My second point is, or my second pivotal moment is the Korean War. So at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States liberated Korea from the Japanese. And Korea was divided on the 38th parallel into two zones of occupation. So classically, the Soviets administered the north, the Americans administered the south. Usual style, a socialist state was established in the north, and a so-called how can I put, I think democracy would be a exaggeration,
Stretch.
but yeah. But a different state was established in the south, and both governments said they had the sole legitimacy over the over Korea. So neither accepted that border on the 38th parallel as permanent. And in 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. The invasion initially was very successful. The South Koreans and the US were pushed right back to Busan, which is down in the south. And the United Nations also entered the war. And this is quite unique here. This is the first sort of major test of the United Nations, forming an army to defend South Korea. And this army consisted of a variety, a big variety of countries, but it was really the US and the Commonwealth countries that probably took the brunt of the fighting there. So with the United Nations in retreat, General MacArthur, who people will know from World War II, came up with a plan to make an amphibious landing further up the peninsula, i.e. behind the North Korean lines, which ultimately was very successful, forced the North Koreans to retreat. The United Nations then entered North Korea, moved up close to the Chinese border, which China didn't like, and therefore then came in on the side of the North Koreans. And ultimately there was an armistice agreed, but this was the first genuinely hot war between the communist and the capitalist world. Admittedly, it was the Chinese in direct conflict with the United Nations, and therefore in direct contact with the US and British and Commonwealth troops as well. But I think the other interesting thing, which is less known, is there were Soviet pilots flying some of the jets, the North Korean jets. So the Soviet Union was actually in direct conflict with the United States here, but that's a lesser known side of things. But the war was one of the most destructive conflicts of the modern era. I think about 3 million fatalities, and a larger proportional civilian death toll than World War II or the Vietnam War, from what I understand. So that's why that has to be there, because it's a hot war within the Cold War.
Again, pivotal moment for sure. I look at Korea, however, as more nothing changed. That's sort of in terms of being pivotal. I from my own standpoint, while being important in its own right in terms of the history of the Cold War and the progress, at the end of the day, there wasn't a change in Soviet policy. There wasn't a change in Chinese policy, US policy. It reinforced the status quo. Both sides were willing to throw down arms, certainly, but I think that had been to a limited degree. Obviously, the US had, or MacArthur had considered the use of nuclear weapons, but he was dismissed over his on using weapons on China, maintaining a status quo.
Yeah.
To me, Korea, while being really important, I'm going to disagree with you, Ian, but I see it as
that's what you're here for. We don't want this to just be a nodding game here. Go on, David.
No, I was just say I think that it's an incredibly important series of events, an incredibly important war that I'm sure someone in the comments will point out that's still technically ongoing because there's never been an actual peace treaty. But in terms of the actual progress of the Cold War, it reinforced a status quo as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, I think you're right there, up to a point. I think what's pivotal here is probably more the United Nations connection, in so much that after this, they sort of stepped away from any form of intervention on this sort of scale again. It was generally peacekeeping rather than war fighting position. So, but yeah, no, you've made some very valid points there, David.
To also just to further to the UN comment, Ian, the UN intervention realistically should never have happened. It only came about because the Soviet Union, the ambassador to the UN, had decided to protest and not attend the day that the vote was held, an emergency vote. He was there in protest of the quote-unquote wrong China being represented in the Security Council.
Right.
If the Soviets had been in attendance, obviously with their veto in the Security Council, it would never have been a UN mission. It would have been a strictly US, possibly a Commonwealth mission, but never with the blue flag.
Right. Okay, I wasn't aware of that. I've learnt something, as I always do from Cold War TV.
That's what we're here for, Ian. So.
Well, good public service.
But as I said, I definitely agree that the Korean War is a hugely significant moment. I personally, again, don't look at it as being changing necessarily, like being one of those turning moments in the conduct of the war.
Yeah.
The Cold War.
Yeah. Okay, go on, hit me with yours then.
So my second point is Operation Ajax, which is probably one of the lesser known events in the Cold War. 1953, it was a US-backed forced regime change in Iran. The democratically elected Mossadegh government, who was looking towards nationalization of the oil fields, very much removing US and ultimately like British influence in Iran. The US sponsored and backed a coup to remove Mossadegh and reinforce the Shah's rule, keeping keeping Western influence in Iran under the Shah. Now, this wasn't necessarily done for even ideological reasons, so much as it was done for corporatist reasons. It was very much at the behest of the oil company, to the behest and the benefit of the oil companies, who needed to maintain, obviously, their property that they had in the Gulf region. What that did, twofold. Obviously, it keeps U.S. influence, U.S. and Western-backed influence in Iran for another till 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah by the Ayatollah. But there's a long-term destabilization that happens in the Middle East where public opinion is suddenly no longer relevant. It also sets a course of demonstrated U.S. regime change to back corporate interests. And you see that, again, not that there hadn't been attempts prior to that, successful attempts, especially in Central and South America, but certainly this was a more far-ranging event, going all the way to Iran to do this. And it certainly set the course for the US to intervene where it felt it could gain the most, not only strategically, from a geostrategic perspective, but also to benefit its own capitalist interests.
Yeah. No, that's. I mean, I was aware of the coup, but I wasn't aware of some of the detail in there, particularly the CIA involvement.
Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's there's a relationship. I want to say it's his nephew was one of the key orchestrators of the overthrow. So
Right. And when you said American interest, was BP involved in this as well?
BP was one of the main benefactors. Certainly,
Right.
there was British benefactors. I think that is the best word. Definitely beneficiaries from that. Shell, but there was like Aramco. There's several U.S. oil firms that, and it's not like the U.S. wasn't involved with BP as well. So
Yeah. Okay.
certainly I don't want to say the start of corporatism, but certainly a very large advancement of the U.S. government and U.S. Industry working together to globally to make sure that the U.S. got its way.
Yeah, which continues as a theme for ever and a day to some degree.
Different YouTube channel, different podcast.
Yeah. Let's not get on to contemporary politics. I always find that's not a good idea, particularly for the comment section. Shall I go ahead with my third?
Yeah.
Pivotal
What's your
moment?
third point?
Okay,
Please.
the third one I've got is Hungary in 1956. So this is the first time a government of a Warsaw Pact country tries to leave the Soviet orbit. There'd been uprisings before in Eastern Europe, probably most notably in East Germany in 1953, but that wasn't a government change there. That was a workers' uprising, whereas this was the government actually wanting to leave the Warsaw Pact. So this started as a student protest in October 56. And amongst the student demands were the subtle demands of the immediate evacuation of all Soviet troops, election by secret ballot of all party members, and all of those things which were guaranteed to go down well with any communist or that certainly go down well with the Soviet Union. Now, a new government was constituted under the direction of Imre Nagy, who was a member of the Hungarian Workers' Party, the Communist Party himself. So it wasn't a complete regime change, but these leaders recognized that the general population didn't want to carry on in the way that the government had been working previously. So the revolt rapidly spread. The people organized themselves into militias and they attacked the secret police, the AVH, and Soviet troops. And it was a very violent revolution. A number of these secret police members were lynched or when they were captured. The new government was formed and disbanded the AVH and declared its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and re-establish free elections. So the Soviet Union initially withdrew their troops from Budapest. And at that point, Imre Nagy and a lot of Hungary thought, great, we've done it. We've actually managed to escape from the Warsaw Pact. But very shortly afterwards, the Soviet army returned, very heavy fighting in Budapest. And Imre Nagy, as well as various other members of his government, were captured. Nagy was executed. There, a new leader was brought in and communism was re-established. However, I think what's particularly interesting with Hungary is over the years, Hungary actually becomes the most liberal, in inverted commas, of all the Warsaw Pact countries. And one of the phrases that I've heard is it was the happiest barracks in the bloc. I can't remember who said that phrase, but certainly the population had a more liberal government than certainly most of the Warsaw Pact, certainly as it moved into the 1980s. Now, I could have also potentially chosen Czechoslovakia in 1968 as well, which was another country who attempted to leave the Warsaw Pact. But I think Hungary in 56 is the important one because it's after the death of Stalin, and it underlines that Khrushchev, who was in power at that point, is not going to, be a lightweight. He's not going to let countries go their own way. He's going to insist on keeping this the Warsaw Pact together. So that's why I've chosen it, because it really does put a line down to other countries that this is what happens if you try and leave the Warsaw Pact. Hopefully you're going to slightly agree with this one, David.
I absolutely agree with you, Ian, and it actually ties in wonderfully with my point number 3, actually, which was I went slightly further back than yourself. I actually chose February of 1956 and the 20th Party Congress and the secret speech given by Khrushchev. And that was the beginning of sort of the thaw, the de-Stalinization process, which directly led to things like the Poznan protest in Poland in June, but resulted in some government change in Poland by October of 1956, but then also to what I can only refer to as the tragic events in Budapest in October, November of 1956. The secret speech was a sort of one of those key pivotal moments in terms of the moving away from the terror and the repression of Stalin without completely removing socialism and communism from the catalog. There was an attempt at reform and liberalization, and I think putting that in quotations is an excellent, excellent idea, because it's all depends on where you start, how much it looks like a reform. So, but no, the Hungarian uprising, Hungarian Revolution, Budapest 1956 is a massive, key, critical turning point, simply because it shows what the Soviet government was willing, capable, and able to do if it saw one of its member clients, satellite states, decide that it no longer wanted to be associated and affiliated to Moscow.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and I think that period of Khrushchev is an interesting one, because he is almost described as he was trying to bring in Gorbachev-style reforms to some degree, but he obviously had the iron fist policy as well there.
It's funny. Khrushchev is it's almost coming in between Stalin and Brezhnev the way that he did. It's almost this weird, I don't want to use the word interregnum, but it's this weird, strange period where the ideas of reform and liberalization in the Soviet Union get talked about. And then when you start looking at what those reforms and those liberalizations look like, there's a connotation in the West that is associated to those words, and they don't exist under Khrushchev, but they do when it's relative to Stalin. Khrushchev's a fascinating individual, both his wartime service, and then rise to leadership, and he's quite I'm very much we haven't gotten quite to Khrushchev on the channel yet, but I'm very much looking forward to trying to pick apart some of what I keep referring to as the Corn Lord. Pick apart some of his motivations and what some of the things that he attempted to do. So
yeah. I presume you listened to my 2-parter where I interviewed his son.
I did. It was that's a fascinating. To all of our viewers, definitely go check out Ian's interview. It's a 2-part interview with Sergei Khrushchev, the son of Nikita, who's a professor in. I'm not sure even he's in the state, in California.
Yeah, he lives in the US somewhere, but he was in his 20s when his father came to power. So it's a really interesting viewpoint. And he talks about meeting Beria and others in there. I mean, it was one of my early interviews, and I was just amazed that I had him on the other line, and we could talk about this stuff. But yeah, no, thank you for that plug, David.
No, definitely. As I said before, in all of the interviews that you've done have been fascinating. Some of them in different ways, but they're all incredibly interesting and well put together, and lots of really good viewpoints of the human side of a 50-year conflict. So
thank you.
Um,
So I think we might be agreeing on the next one.
That's so point. I'll present, I guess. Point number 4 is the Berlin Wall. You can't talk about the Cold War without at least paying some brief mention to the wall that was built in 1961 in Berlin, and it formalized the divide in the city. The Soviets allowed this to happen. Erich Honecker, who eventually became the leader of the DDR, built a wall around the western occupied half of Berlin. It started off as white paint and a lot of barbed wire, and over several decades it turned into concrete walls, minefields, some really advanced, interesting technology, a lot of manpower, a lot of resources being dedicated to it, and shoot to kill orders for anyone who's trying to cross over, under, anything across that barrier. But very much symbolic of the Iron Curtain, that East versus West. So I absolutely, I look at the Berlin Wall from a slightly different perspective than a lot. A lot of people, I think, look at the Berlin Wall as being very much this symbol of opposition, and it reinforced the divide and how much there was us versus them, and that can be applied from no matter which side of the wall you're on. The Berlin Wall, in a lot of ways, actually helped to secure and stabilize the situation in Europe. It was a key focus point, obviously, and if conflict was going to happen, it was very much going to happen in Berlin, as you'd pointed out earlier. However, by creating a physical barrier, there was actually a physical separation, and the chance of a flashpoint happening, which it did several times, or almost did several times in the early days of the wall and prior to the wall being built. I think the Berlin Wall actually helped to stabilize the situation in Europe, to keep a division between two very well-armed sides that really not wanted to shoot at each other, but were certainly prepared to if the need arose.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, from the Allied side, there didn't seem to be a great urgency to do anything about it when it first came up. It was sort of like, oh, thank goodness this is here now. This actually makes the border much clearer, and as you say, prevents misunderstandings. But I mean, later on that year, there is that direct confrontation at Checkpoint Charlie.
True, but I think that's one of those early moments as the wall continued to develop, because obviously it wasn't, as I think it took me a little bit to actually realize this. It wasn't suddenly a concrete barrier with a 100-meter death strip in between that got built suddenly in 1961. It literally was paint and barbed wire, and Allied troops and Soviet troops, technically, in uniform, were free to cross that line at any time. They weren't allowed to be hindered. But the more barriers that you put up and the more you make it difficult, the less likely that misunderstandings and whatnot are going to suddenly occur. It's got to be a much more planned, I would think anyways, I would like to think that it would be a much more planned event for an accident to happen.
Yeah. I mean, the one one that I had as my fourth one was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is just after the building of the wall, and This comes around following the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which is where the Americans, in conjunction with some Cuban emigres, try and overthrow Fidel Castro's government. And it's a miserable failure. No American troops are captured, but the emigres all get rounded up and imprisoned. But what the Americans do is they put Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey. And in response, Khrushchev, that guy again, keeps popping up, agrees to a request from Cuba to place nuclear missiles on Cuba to deter a future invasion. So the Americans establish a blockade on the 22nd of October to prevent, this is a naval blockade on the 22nd of October to prevent further missiles arriving. And there's several days of tense negotiations, some through back channels, and I'm sure David has probably got more insight into this than me. And it results in an agreement between Kennedy and Khrushchev where the Soviets will dismantle the nuclear weapons in Cuba, return them to the Soviet Union in exchange for a US public declaration that they will not invade Cuba. But secretly, they also agree that they will remove these Jupiter ballistic missiles in Turkey. And that's sort of how it ends. But it's a very tense few days where the world appears to be on the edge of a nuclear confrontation. I think what is possibly less known is there was a real danger of a nuclear war by accident during that period, because the US Navy, when they were blockading, were dropping practice depth charges on Soviet submarines. Now, Soviet submarines don't necessarily know what the difference between a practice depth charge and a real one is, because it still makes an explosion and still sounds like somebody's attacking them. And there was one submarine, the B-59, where the captain decided that war might have already started. Now, you might think, well, you know, what's that going to cause? Well, this submarine was armed with nuclear torpedoes. But the decision to launch required the agreement of all of the three officers on board. And famously, Vasily Arkhipov was one of these officers, and he disagreed. And he probably saved the world from nuclear war there. There's other instances where individuals have saved the world from nuclear war, which we might get onto, but that was definitely one. And also led to the establishment of the hotline between Moscow and Washington, which isn't the red phone in David's background there. I think it was a teleprinter or something.
That's I think that's, to me, and I agree 100%. That's actually, Cuban Missile Crisis is my point number 5. Actually, it's, you can't talk about the Cold War without talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think what you've just pointed out, I think what a lot of people don't recognize or realize is that prior, even during the crisis, and certainly all through the 50s, there was no direct line of communication between Washington and Moscow. These are two ridiculously heavily armed, destroy the world 1,000 times over type superpowers who had no direct lines of communication. Everything prior to that was done through Moscow to the Soviet embassy in Washington. The ambassador has to go to the White House, and back and forth. It's this strange, in my mind, days of, especially now, a day of email and cell phone and immediate and instant communication. The idea that two world leaders that are pointing at pointing just weapons of mass destruction at each other like that, have no way of directly communicating to each other, I find that phenomenally bizarre. But the Cuban Missile Crisis definitely spurred the impetus to resolve that, to make sure that there was a way that the president and the premier could, if necessary, to directly talk to each other.
Yeah, yeah, like they did on Doctor Strangelove.
Well, yes, exactly. That's a fantastic movie. I know
yeah.
a lot. Strangely enough, I know a lot of people out there have not seen it, but Ian actually does has just recently, before we all went into lockdown, was lucky enough to attend a viewing of Doctor Strangelove inside of a nuclear bunker, which I think would have been a incredibly eerie and fantastic experience. So.
It was great fun. It was great fun. But if you haven't seen that film, I highly recommend it, if not just for Peter Sellers playing 3 different roles.
It's a fantastic movie. Definitely worth checking out. And I think it's actually even available on archive.org. So, I mean,
right.
It's free to stream out there, folks. So,
okay, well, there you go. What an
when
offer.
when you're done with this, go check that out. So.
Yeah. Okay.
But, no, that was, I mean, Cuban Missile Crisis. You've stolen my point number 5. We are definitely in agreement on that. So.
Hey, at last, we've got one that we agree on. This would have been a very boring episode if we'd agreed on everything, though, David, you know.
Very true. Very true.
Because I know we disagree on my next one, which I find very hard to see why you disagree on this, but it might be just you just trying to be different.
I'm good at that.
That's good. I like, I like a bit of contrariness, but my next one is the rise of Solidarity, the Free Polish Trade Union in 1980. So, as David alluded to earlier, Poland had a number of uprisings and protests. There was Poznan in 1956, in the 1970s in Gdansk, and these were mainly around price rises or changes in working conditions. And by early 1980s, in fact, the late 70s, the Polish economy was in a mess. But it was surprising. And again, this is what people aren't necessarily aware of with the Cold War, is there was a lot of loans being made by Western finance companies to these so-called communist states. So these Western finance companies basically said to the Polish government, they're no longer going to give them loans in order to artificially lower prices and effectively subsidize prices. So the government gives in to the Western finance organizations and announced some price rises in July 1980, particularly for meat. And almost immediately, strikes start and factory occupations start. And the strikes quickly reach the Baltic coast, where there is a sit-down strike in the Lenin shipyard. And amongst the leaders of this strike is Lech Walesa, who, if you don't know that name, you're not a proper Cold War student. And he was a former shipyard electrician. And he, with the assistance of activists from the KOR, which was the Polish Workers' Defense Group, and many other intellectuals, a commission was established to negotiate with the government. And as a result, a free trade union was allowed to be formed in Poland, the first free trade union in any Warsaw Pact country. And from my point of view, this is the first brick falling out of the wall here. You know, this is where the thread starts to unravel, because by allowing Solidarity to be an independent trade union, they inevitably become some sort of political force within Poland. However, in 1981, the communist government declared martial law, believing that, and this is subject to some conjecture, that the Soviet Union was going to invade Poland like it had invaded Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Martial law is eased as the years go on, and eventually in 1989, Solidarity are allowed to stand in elections and unsurprisingly do quite well, although the first election is a limited number of seats that they can run in, but in all the seats that they run in, they do win. And in 1990, they form a government. So, you know, the Polish Free Trade Union movement of 1980, I think is really important. Just as a personal aside, I was in Poland in 1980 on holiday. Don't ask why. And it was September, so it was after the August, after the strikes in August. And there was a genuine feeling that, I thought I was going to wake up one morning and there'd be Russian tanks in the streets, but they weren't. There weren't. And, Poland became one of the first countries to throw off the shackles of the Warsaw Pact. So why do you disagree with that one, David?
It's less that I disagree with you, Ian, so much as I was looking at a more, I think a lot of this explanation as to why Solidarity didn't make my list.
Mm-hmm.
I opted to look at, because I did include a Southeast Asia event, I included a Middle Eastern event, a little less Europe focused. The formation of Solidarity and the rise of Lech Walesa, huge, monumental moments. And I think you make a really strong point and a really, really accurate one that is sort of that first block that falls out of the wall, different wall, but it's that first sort of that start of to the end. But at the time that Solidarity was formed, I mean, that was the late Brezhnev era, when he was more busy mumbling to himself and giving himself medals. That could have ended really differently, I think, for Poland. I think we'll get into, I think we need to talk about why you were in Poland in 1980 on vacation, but that could have been a real outcome of Soviet tanks rolling back into the streets of Warsaw. Amazing that it didn't, and I think that's sort of circumstance, happenstance, luck, like a lot of things in history. But it's not that I disagree that Solidarity is unimportant. I opted to include some other things on my list, which meant that unfortunately Solidarity was sacrificed.
No, and you've been probably more even-handed than me, because you have gone for the whole geopolitical view, whereas as we sort of spoke about earlier, I tend to be Eurocentric, and not have that broader view. But I am being educated by the Cold War TV channel into different areas.
I'll be perfectly upfront. Prior to us starting this channel, there was a lot of these events that I was aware that they had happened. Like I knew that there was the Malayan emergency, which you referred to earlier. I knew that was a thing, but I didn't really know much about the Malayan emergency. Indonesia, same, like the rise of Sukarno. I knew that that happened, but I didn't know sort of how that fit into the broader scheme. The Cold War wasn't. It truly was a global event. I mean, there isn't a corner of the world that didn't, maybe Bhutan, that didn't get sort of sucked into some form of geopolitics, whether it was actively engaged in choosing sides, or whether it was something like the non-aligned movement, where it was actively trying to keep themselves out of a side. So I think that's this channel for me has been an education and continues to be every day. So it's not as I'm a middle-aged white Canadian guy. It's it's what I grew up on in terms of knowing about the Cold War was very Eurocentric. This has been a really great opportunity for me to sort of look further afield and sort of figure out that there's a lot of really serious impact that the conflict had all over. So
and I think I've found that with the podcast as well. It's been a great journey of discovery, and I have learned loads that I didn't know about, and I've been quite surprised by the emotions that I found in some of the interviews. I mean, when you're talking to people about this sort of stuff, I've done interviews on Cold War Conversations where these people haven't even shared these stories with their family, and it's almost cathartic for them to tell me these stories, and that has really astonish me. I guess it shouldn't have done, but it does. When you're hearing it firsthand from somebody who was there, it's so immediate. You don't get that from a textbook. And when I sort of think to myself, I've actually spoken to the son of Nikita Khrushchev and asked him about what his dad got up to, I have to pinch myself sometimes.
I think we'll come around to our point 6 here in a second, but I think what I think often, another thing that often gets lost, and I think your podcast does a really great job of bringing this home, is that it's all about people, and it doesn't matter where you grew up, it doesn't matter how you grew up, like what your beliefs were. The one recurring thing that I always hear from your guests, especially those who grew up in Germany, in East Germany, Poland, wherever they may happen to have grown up, is that they all say that they had great childhoods. They remember they're having fun, and it wasn't a question of I knew that the leader of our country was this terrible man that was throwing people in prison for dissenting political opinion. It was I had my family and I had my siblings around me, and we went to school, and it really is sort of that humanizing aspect to that. It's not ideology is this thing that gets bolted on at some point, but fundamentally we're all people.
Yeah, life just carries on. You get married, you go to school, all of that stuff just carries on, but in a slightly different way, and sometimes in a political frame as well, particularly in Eastern Europe. But you find that even speaking to people who grew up in the West as well, and the portrayal of life in Eastern Europe is always this grim, grey, dull place. And yes, it was in cases, but you're right, that is a very common theme. Childhood, had a great time, absolutely fantastic time as a child, and then when they get older, they sort of notice more what's going on around them.
Usually about 14, 15 years old. That sort of seems to be that key. My son happens to be 15. I'm waiting for him to put a bunch of red flags or something up in his room. So we'll see. That's point number 6.
Right. I've somehow missed a point here. I've got 2 more to go. But I'll go with my next point, which was Gorbachev, which I think as far as the end of the Cold War, without him, it potentially didn't happen, or somebody in his mold. And I did an interview not so long ago with an author called Archie Brown, who's a Oxford University academic. And that was a really interesting chat, because he gave me some insight that I hadn't realized, is that Gorbachev was a close friend with somebody involved in the Prague Spring, which I hadn't known about. And that appeared to be pretty influential in some of his thinking. Now, bizarrely, Andropov, who was the former KGB head, actually wanted Gorbachev to be the next leader, and Andropov was almost more hardline than Brezhnev, from what I could make out in some of his views. But Gorbachev didn't become the next leader after Andropov, because the rest of the Politburo thought he was too young and inexperienced. So they put in the athletic Konstantin Chernenko, who promptly died pretty shortly after. He was more geriatric than athletic. Died 1 year later, resulting in Gorbachev almost being the only option. And it's interesting because the involvement of Margaret Thatcher in the story is quite unlikely here, because prior to becoming leader, Gorbachev had visited Britain and met with Thatcher. And in fact, the author that I interviewed, Archie Brown, had actually said to Thatcher, you should keep an eye on this guy, because I think he's really going places. And Thatcher famously said after that meeting, I like Mr. Gorbachev, we can do business together. And that really helped Gorbachev, because Thatcher was best buddies with Ronald Reagan, who was the president of the US at the time. He very much valued Margaret Thatcher's viewpoint, and for Thatcher to be backing Gorbachev really helped to get some traction there. So Gorbachev becomes leader. There's some really amazing moments, I think, early on, particularly Reykjavik in 1986, where they almost agree to get rid of strategic nuclear weapons. And when you actually think about that, that is just mind-boggling that they came so close to actually getting an agreement there. But Reagan was insistent that he retained SDI, which was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was the Star Wars program, and it all fell apart. But Gorbachev moves ahead with perestroika, his restructuring, and glasnost with his openness policy. And in 91, there is a coup in Moscow with some hardliners who decide that he is actually going too far. I'm surprised they let him go that long, to be honest. Which eventually falls apart. But in the meantime, the nationalist the nationalism reappears within the constituent parts of the Soviet Union, and the nation starts to splinter, with Yeltsin wanting to take charge of Boris Yeltsin, who was formerly the Communist Party, wants to take Russia out of the Soviet Union, and the various parts of the Soviet Union agree to dismember, and Gorbachev loses power. But I think, without him, the Soviet Union could almost still be with us, like North Korea. Now, there's a statement, David.
I can't disagree. My point number 6 is actually, I think it straddles the line between your point number 5 of Gorbachev and your point number 6, which I'm not going to steal your thunder, but my point number 6, and I'll bring this back into to your point. July 7th, 1989, Gorbachev renounces the use of all force against East European nations. This is a public statement that he made, which effectively gave free license to the Warsaw Pact nations, to any sort of Soviet satellite state, that the Soviet Union was not going to use force to put down any type of rebellion, any type of dissent, which, as you've rightly pointed out, 1956 in Budapest, 1968 with the Prague Spring, all of these were crushed, and there was always the latent threat of Soviet tanks rolling into Warsaw or to Gdansk to put down any type of dissent. That statement by Gorbachev is absolutely key to allowing the later events of 1989 and into 1990 to occur. Your choice of Gorbachev as a whole, I think, is wholly accurate. He's a fascinating individual. I'm actually just finishing a biography of Gorbachev by William Taubman, which is proving to be really quite interesting, because there's a lot of things in there that I wasn't aware of. I still don't think of Gorbachev as being history so much as being current events, but that's probably just a sign of my age.
Yeah. Well, it's that Pizza Express advert as well, isn't there? Or Pizza Hut advert. Have you not seen the Gorbachev Pizza Hut advert?
Oh, yes. Yeah. 100%. That's he only agreed to do that because he was completely bankrupt.
Right. Wow. Incredible.
That's what communism will get you. I'm sure that'll come up in the comments at some point. So.
Oh yeah. I think that the other point about your point about the allowing the Eastern European countries to go their way. There's one of my favorite Cold War quotes that comes out of this, and I think it's somebody in the Soviet foreign ministry, where he says, and I have to paraphrase this because I can't remember the exact wording, but he says, the Brezhnev doctrine is no more. We're now going to start using the Sinatra doctrine because the countries can do it their way, or something like. I can't remember the exact phrase. And who expected the Soviet foreign ministry to be cracking jokes?
It certainly wouldn't have happened pre-Gorbachev. So
yeah, no, but it's and it does lead on to my final point, which, the fall of the wall. We talked about Hungary, and we talked about their liberalism, and that did result in them opening their borders, which gave an escape route for the East Germans who holidayed in Hungary to be able to get out into Austria. Also resulted in a number of East Germans climbing into West German embassies in Prague and in Warsaw as well. And so Honecker, who is the leader at this point, agrees with the West Germans to allow these people in the embassies to leave, but they have to leave via sealed trains, which is not a very good analogy for Honecker to come out with because of German history of sealed trains. But he insists that they have to pass through East Germany, which result in riots in East Germany as they pass through cities like Dresden. The population essentially sort of loses its fear of protest at this point. It's a really unusual period because, it's almost like one day they're terrified of the Stasi and the next day they're, out on the streets. I mean, it does grow. And there's, some influence from the churches, which were seen as places where, some of these organizations could, take refuge as well. And new groups start to appear, like Neues Forum, which was the largest of these groups. And eventually Honecker is deposed by Egon Krenz, who was effectively the heir apparent. So the East German people don't really see any change there. But Egon Krenz realizes that freedom of travel is a critical piece that he has to allow the East German population to have. And on the 9th of November, he gives a note to Gunter Schabowski, who then appears, he's in the East German Politburo, he then appears at a press conference where he says, yes, freedom of travel will start. And what he should have said is freedom of travel will start tomorrow. And you have to get your passport stamped. But he didn't say that. He's asked when it starts, and he says, sofort, immediately. And the border crossings in Berlin and elsewhere are rapidly overwhelmed by huge groups of East Germans who are saying, we've just heard that, we can cross now. Let us through. And the border guards are overwhelmed, and they very intelligently make the decision to not resist and to let people through. And as they say, the rest is history.
I find the entire story surrounding that night, November 9th, to be absolutely just that one word, sofort, is so how to not prepare yourself for a press conference. Which is what I find really interesting about that night is, and I think you've had guests on that have made sort of allusions to this, is the number of East Germans that heard about the press conference from West German television as opposed to from anything inside the DDR, which I find that's actually quite telling in and of itself. But no, the night that the Berlin Wall came down, obviously, like that's, by most reckonings, that's the end of the Cold War. Like right there, It all comes tumbling down. Our channel may or may not ever last that long that we actually get to cover that, but
Oh,
It's,
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will. How old were you when the wall came down, David, if you don't mind me asking?
I was 12 when the wall came down, but I didn't find out about it until about a week later. I was living in South Asia at the time, with famously poor communication connection to the outside world, basically. And it took about a week for us to hear there that the wall had actually come down and that
Yeah.
it was a different world out there. So my I feel like almost like one of those Japanese soldiers that comes out of the forest 30 years later to find out that the war's been over.
Yeah.
But that's my. I have no recollection of the night that the wall came down because I completely missed it. So
Yeah. I mean, I remember it quite vividly because I remember thinking, I'm actually living through history here. This is something that hopefully my kids will, ask me, what was it like? Do you remember it at the time? And it was just unbelievable because I'd been to Berlin in June of that year, to visit, and had crossed over into East Berlin about 5 or 6 times because I was fascinated by the process and the country itself. And I thought that wall was going to be there for another, 50, 60 years or so. And, to see it fall apart was just unbelievable. And then how rapidly things moved with the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria folded almost overnight, and then the bloody events in Romania in December with Ceausescu. But the speed of events was phenomenal.
it was so I this may be news for some of even for our followers here. In the summer of 1990, I with my family we moved to Budapest, and it was coming out. It was sort of this post communist hangover. It was still very very communist, um, and within a year, it was a completely different country. Um, from the summer of 1990 to the summer of 1991, it just felt totally like a totally different place.
Yeah.
It wasn't always a great place for a lot of people. Obviously, there's some really really hard times for a lot of people that went through that transition, but there was a sense of hope and optimism, and um, this is impossible to recapture now. But Eastern European communism has a smell. Um, and I don't know if I'm curious if that smell carried over into West Berlin as well. But it's the smell of lignite coal and Trabants, which has it's a terrible smell, to be honest. It's
Yeah.
acrid, very acidic smelling, and that was gone. It was there for the first sort of winter that we were there, 1990, and then it was gone. It was never to be smelt again, kind of thing. So.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was present when you were anytime that you'd been to Berlin. But.
It did. I mean, it did carry over into West Berlin. And I recently did an interview with a British Army squaddy who served in Berlin in the 1980s. And he said he distinctly remembers stepping off the plane and what is that smell?
Yeah.
And it was the lignite that they were using to fuel the factories, which was this soft coal that was very pollutant. And also the two-stroke engines of the Trabants. I mean, when you went over into East Berlin, there was much less traffic over there, but you had this distinct noise of these engines, these like lawnmower engines whizzing around. But the Trabant is quite a collector's item now. I mean, I'm in touch with a guy who lives not far from me who collects them. And I did go for a ride in one and didn't find it a great ride because it was almost like being at sea. I was on the back seat and it was quite, the movement. I didn't like it at all. But
they were unpleasant vehicles all around. But part of me wishes I could go back 30 years and kind of
Yeah.
stash one away. But
Yeah. Have you heard about that thing in Berlin called the time? It's called time travel or something like that, where basically it's a virtual reality attraction where you can cross into East Berlin, and they basically take you on a coach trip around East Berlin, and you can look round 360 degree.
I have, and I'm not sure. It may have been Shane Whaley on,
Yes.
from Radio GDR,
Mm.
his podcast. I think he was talking about it in a past episode. So I have heard of this, but it's I would, the nostalgic part of me would love to be able to do that in a couple of different cities. So I think that would be absolutely fascinating. See if you can recapture the smell, though. So
Yeah. Well, Shane was saying it was so realistic. He was trying to get his phone out of his pocket to take photos without, thinking, "Oh, hang on, that's not going to work." David, I have very much enjoyed this. This has been great fun. I'm glad we finally got together to do a joint episode. It's been great.
Likewise, Ian. I came into this knowing that it was going to be a lot of fun, but this has been really a lot of fun. It's always enjoyable having a conversation with someone who's as knowledgeable and is interested in the Cold War and across lots of different aspects. And I try to have these conversations with my family, and they look at me like I have three heads. It just
join the club.
They have no interest. So
no.
This has been fantastic to my viewers of the Cold War channel. Certainly do check out Ian's podcast, Cold War Conversations, available through all good podcast applications out there. Ian gets on some amazing guests, fantastic interviews, really interesting. Definitely worth the listen. Go through the entire back catalog. It's well worth your time. All 4 days plus of it. I've done it myself. I'm actually caught up, which I don't say often with a lot of podcasts, but it's definitely check out Ian and Cold War Conversations.
Well, David, you're too kind. There will be a Cold War Conversations coaster on its way to you. In thanks for that, for making that plug. But to all the Cold War Conversations listeners, I highly recommend David's YouTube channel. It's an excellent resource. How many episodes you got there, David, now?
Actually, I was talking with our historian and producer this morning. We're over 60 episodes. We do release one episode a week, moving in a vaguely chronological fashion. We're somewhere into the mid to late 50s at this point, but we're about 60 episodes in. So,
but they're really good because David covers, the major events of the Cold War, but also the less major events. I've learned a lot with some of the episodes, like the coup in Iran and things like that you wouldn't otherwise know about. Certainly from my Eurocentric view of the Cold War, it certainly expanded my knowledge. But it's great to watch, and your popularity, David recently got a silver YouTube award for the number of subscribers to the channel. So it's going from strength to strength. I'm very envious of the set that he has behind him there, which I just chuck up a few books and.
This is all our producer's handiwork. There's a Lego set that I think back there somewhere that I put together. That was an afternoon that I decided that I was going to do that. But we're actually going to be hopefully we're going to be redoing and updating our studio in the imminent future. Just as it's got a very 50s feel to it right now. As we're moving forward in time, we're going to change that up and give it maybe a bit more of a 60s basement sort of feel. So.
Oh, right. Great. Well, no, I'll look forward to that. But yeah, highly recommended. Cold War TV. You'll find them on YouTube. And Cold War Conversations, just search for us in your favorite podcast app. You will be more than welcome to join us.
Thank you very much for having me on, Ian. This has been a great pleasure. I've been wanting to. I've never been a guest on a podcast, so this has been a lot of fun.
Oh wow! Oh, I didn't know that. Gosh. Well, it's been an honor. It's been an honor. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Ian.